whichever works best for you. Alrighty, good evening, everyone. My name is Daniel Baird, and I'm an event facilitator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. And before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are on Treaty 1 territory. Now, the land on which we are gathered is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Aninawak, Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Red River Métis. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. And we, of course, are so pleased to have all of you here to welcome Bob Joseph to Winnipeg in support of his latest, already best-selling book, 21 Things You Need to Know About Indigenous Self-Government, a conversation about dismantling the Indian Act. And many thanks to PageTwo Books for publishing this book and for making this evening a reality, in collaboration with the good people at Raincoast Books. We are also delighted to be partnering with our good friends at Plume Winnipeg to co-present this event as part of the Thin Air 2025, whose director, Charlene Deal, will be out at the end of the presentation, for the closing comments and to go over signing procedure for tonight. So after the presentation this evening, I'm going to come by with this wireless microphone for a question portion of the evening. So if you do have a question, any questions at all, just raise your hand nice and high enough for me to see, and then I'll come by with this wireless microphone, and then we'll be able to get your question audible on today's live stream and for those who are here today in the audience. And now, of course, I do have the pleasure of introducing tonight's guest. Bob Joseph is president of Indigenous Corporate Training Incorporated, has provided training on Indigenous relations since 1994. He has a diverse range of clients, including all levels of government, Fortune 500 companies, resource development companies, and small and medium-sized businesses. He's also the author of the national bestseller, 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act. That book captured the attention of hundreds of thousands of Canadians by shining a light on the Indian Act and the problems associated with it. In his new book, Bob Joseph shows us the path forward and explains why Indigenous self-governance is the absolute necessity. So please join me in welcoming Bob Joseph.
All right. Thank you, Daniel. That was very well done. I like the land acknowledgement. I'm really happy to be here and to have you all here this evening. This is great. So many people, and the journey. This is about day. I can't remember how many days. Jamie and Laura and I have been sort of traveling around the country. What was it? Calgary yesterday, Saskatoon the day before. So we're making the rounds, but I feel like I'm getting closer to getting to go home this weekend. So I'm pretty excited about that. In terms of our presentation this evening, I'm going to just talk very briefly. We built into the title a conversation about dismantling the Indian Act, and so I definitely want to do that with you this evening. It's what we've been doing the whole time as we've made these presentations, and so we'll try to do that. Again, Daniel talked about the genesis a little bit, how we find ourselves here, and it really starts with a blog article, 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act. And I was learning how to be a blogger, and I read an article that said, if you want to be a good blogger, you have to write lists of things. So the list should be 7 to 10 things long, and people will read the list. And so I thought, okay, what's my list? And I've been doing Indigenous awareness training with people, or working effectively with Indigenous peoples training for a really long time. And I started to think about, in the classroom, what were people really impacted by? And I realized it was the Indian Act stuff. So I put my head down and I started typing. And when I looked up, there were 21 things. So I broke the 7 to 10 rule, and I thought, I'm going to publish this anyways. And so published it, and within the first month, we had over 50,000 people just from Facebook. We were on Twitter and LinkedIn and some of the other social media stuff at that time, but just from Facebook, we had over 50,000 people come in off of a link from Facebook to read the article. And so I thought, a little bit of a shameless marketer too. I wonder if this is another marketing channel. This book has certainly become much more personal in terms of the impact on my family and the work that I do. And we approached PageTwo and said, hey, we've got this idea for a book. What do you think? And they said, Bob, we have really great people that come through here, authors who tell great stories. They're great technical writers, or some combination of those two things. And most of them don't have what you have, which is an understanding that people are interested in this topic and will probably want to read. We think you should publish because we think it'll go viral in bookstores. So many would-be authors out there, people always ask me, I'm thinking about being an author, what should I do? And I would say, well, start blogging, see if people are interested in what it is you have to write about. And that has been a really tremendous opportunity, and it's led us here today. So in terms of Indigenous self-government, after all of the book tour stuff, thanks McNally and Jamie and PageTwo and all of the other folks that have helped bring us all here together, we realized that people were still curious. They wanted to know more. Bob, can we get rid of it? What would it look like? How would it work? And so we started to think maybe that's what we write about next. And I reached out to Jamie and I said, Jamie, I've got this idea for a book, but can you give me maybe a few festivals or places where I could go to just sort of test the content, a rough idea. We went to a few places. Ottawa, I'll tell you, I still remember our Ottawa trip, but I told the audience I'm thinking about writing a book about Indigenous self-government. I spent the rest of the night answering questions about sovereignty, usually the same one that lasted for, say the whole night. People were really curious. Well, when you get your own nation within a nation, how are you gonna do passports and, all of those kinds of things. And so we realized, okay, depending on where you are in the country, we'll have to answer the sovereignty question and separation and those kinds of things. And before I forget, and in case I forget, when I talk about Indigenous self-government, it's not a broad sovereignty movement. It's not a separatist movement, just so people understand what it is. When I look at Treaty 1 or Treaty 6, 7, or 8, they all have treaties with this country. They volunteered to go fight in World War I and World War II, knowing that they were probably going to lose their Indian status under the Indian Act, but they volunteered anyways because they had, in their words, we have a treaty with this nation and we want to make sure that that continues to be honored, and we don't know that other people will, so they were quite happy to volunteer to fight. And honestly, they've always been military and economic allies when we look back through the whole history of the country, and certainly the Royal Proclamation of October 1763, King George III recognizes them as nations or tribes, that we need to work with them on that basis, that they own the lands that they live on, and that we need to purchase, it needs to be purchased by us, or it's reserved to them, or any of them as their hunting grounds. And so that was sort of the genesis of the relationship. And he did it because he needed military and economic allies. There were other competing colonial governments, Spanish traders advancing northward from Mexico, Russian traders advancing southward from Alaska. Certainly, the War of 1812, there were a lot of competing interests, and what King George III had realized was that they'd be very valuable military and economic allies. And so he went about this process of negotiating treaties. Some of the wording in there, they're not to be molested or disturbed in the possession of such parts of our dominions and territories as not having been purchased by or ceded to us or reserved to them, or any of them as their hunting grounds. He envisioned a relationship where we would really live side by side, walk together. And so often you'll hear in Ontario, you can see even graffiti on downtown buildings where all treaty people. And so I think there's some real validity there. And that was sort of how we started this relationship. Our journey as a country really began with that. We still do it today. We're negotiating modern treaties in places like British Columbia where we didn't do the work because the Indian Act came along right at the time of the treaty making process, making it to British Columbia. We worked our way across the continent with the fur trade, the gold rush, agricultural expansion, the coming of the railroad, and right about the time we hit British Columbia, Canada becomes a country, and we passed the British North America Act, which in the new relationship, as it would be, the federal government sets itself up as the trustee, and bands and their members become wards of the crown. And we embark on a different Indian policy, this policy of assimilation that you would have learned about in 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act. And so that happened right at the time we were going to do treaties in British Columbia. And the thinking was, there's not really any need to do treaties right now because eventually they'll assimilate, become like everybody else, and we won't have to do this work. And for those that had treaties, Treaty 1, we wouldn't have to honor historic treaties. And so the Indian Act really, that's what it was designed to do, forcibly culturally assimilate its residential schools and banning of potlatches, hereditary versus elected chiefs. A lot of the issues that we wrestle with today really have roots into the Indian Act. And so self-government is going to be a part of that journey. Before the Indian Act, tribes across the country were self-governing peoples. We lived in self-governing communities, different types of governance. One of the things about working with Indigenous peoples is they're really quite diverse. We have all kinds of different social structures and regional differences. So when I talk about self-government, I don't speak for all Indigenous peoples, but I can tell you there's a lot of common elements that go into the 25, 26 self-government agreements that we have with over 45 First Nations and some of the treaties. So there's lots of common elements, but there are going to be differences, cultural, regional differences that we'll see. And but as we progress through the assimilation policy era, by the late 1960s, we're doing a little bit of soul searching as a country, and it was the Elder Trudeau, can I say that? Is that proper? Elder Trudeau and Chrétien were tasked with what to do about the Indian Act. So they went out and talked to people and put together a 1969 white paper policy paper. And in their white paper policy paper, they said, what we have to do if we want to become a more just society, their words, we need to get rid of the Indian Act and we need to transfer title of the reserves to the Indians. And it was, it is kind of where they want to go if we think about self-government, but at that time, the chiefs heard that Canada is just going to cut us loose right now at our worst period in our history with little or no opportunity to pick ourselves up and look after ourselves. And so they countered with a red paper policy paper, and that led into more conversation. And ultimately by 1982, we started to see a real move away from the assimilation policy. By 1982, Section 35 of the Constitution Act, subsection 1, says that we hereby recognize and affirm the existing Aboriginal treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada. And so that marked the end, at least legislatively, of forced cultural assimilation. And we were now going to have to figure out how to recognize and affirm. And since that time, we've been doing a number of self-government agreements, a number of modern treaties to try to figure out what to do with Indian policy, particularly the Indian Act. And like 21 Things, it sort of came out right around the beginning of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the 94 calls to action. This book has come out just in front of next year, which will be 150 years of the Indian Act. And I had a conversation with Manny Jules. He said it's one of the top 5 oldest pieces of legislation in the country. And to the Indigenous peoples that I'm connected with and talk to and work with, they were already asking me because of 21 Things, what are you going to do about next year? We're expecting a big conversation about the Indian Act and trying to figure out what to do with it as a country. And so we're gonna be well timed for that conversation, and that's part of what went into the title. This will be a conversation. We really hope that folks like yourselves will get involved in that conversation. We give you a bunch of ideas in the book, and really we'll try to move a little quicker. I know 25 agreements sounds like a lot, but that's been since 1982 with 40 some on First Nations, but there's actually over 600 of them. So we have to try and figure out how to move a little bit quicker than we have been. And so that's kind of a snapshot of 21 things you should know about Indigenous self-government. We start to answer the tough questions. I know Daniel and I were talking just out of the room here, and we were talking about the work that we're doing, and I've totally lost the train of thought. We're going to keep moving. Sorry, Daniel.
That's okay.
But all of that's to say we're going to move into this time frame. Oh, I should also mention the duty to consult. Have you been hearing about the major projects? Canada's selected 5 major projects. They're hoping to do another 5 really quickly. And the concern with First Nations right now about major projects is that we're going to really fast track those projects at the expense of the environment and at the expense of First Nations constitutionally protected rights, or Aboriginal people's constitutionally protected rights. So again, the Indian Act can often be right in the front and center, even though we don't think of it as an Indian Act issue. I look back to the Coastal GasLink project, which had a Wet'suwet'en hereditary chief component. And if you think back to the narrative around the Coastal GasLink project, the narrative was we have signed agreements with all of the elected councils all along the pipeline. And so if you're really on the ball, you were thinking, what about the hereditary chiefs who keep asking to be talked to? There were, when I think about a landmark court case like Delgamuukw and Gisdaywa, which since 1997 have brought another couple hundred cases on this idea, this duty to consult that governments have when it comes to development with Indigenous peoples. We do that because Delgamuukw and Gisdaywa, those 2 hereditary chiefs from the Gitxsan and Wet'suwet'en, they weren't successful in court, got referred back to a lower court because of errors in how it had been brought to the High Court. And the judges, though, said, this stuff is going to get resolved. We're eventually going to decide, or governments, you're going to have to sit down and negotiate with them. But either way, it's going to get resolved. We just think it's going to take a little bit of time. And in that little bit of time, we don't want governments running roughshod on their rights. There has to be something for them at the end of all of this. And so we're going to put into place this thing called a duty to consult, and we want you to go and talk to them before you build anything, so that at the end of all of this, they maybe can have title to land and rights to fish and hunt and all kinds of other things like that. So the Indian Act and the duty to consult, again, going to be a big part of the conversation this fall. We're expecting choppy waters and strong headwinds around the issue of the duty to consult. And whether it happens, we're hopeful. We hear the government talking about everything in partnership, and we haven't seen anything yet. And so anyways, there you go, a little bit for you just about that. And I think this book and the idea of self-government would be helpful. If we would have worked it out with the Wet'suwet'en, it might be an easier conversation this time. And when I think about self-government in terms of benefits, not just for Indigenous peoples, but for Canadians, to have this sorted out, to be working with groups of people that have governments where they elect the people and are accountable to their people, as opposed to Indigenous Services Canada, that would make a pretty huge difference in creating economic certainty. We could avoid a Wet'suwet'en coastal gas link, and it was a costly endeavor, right? And I'm not just talking about the blockade. It was a $17 million RCMP sort of confrontation, but it was the railway blockades and the ports and all of that other stuff. In addition to the cost overruns, I think about the Trans Mountain Crossing project. It was originally billed as a $4.5 billion project. The engineers said, we can do this. It cost $4.5 billion. The most recent report puts the price tag at around $34 billion. So I think if we could have supported and really worked out with the communities a notion of self-government, we might not have had some of those conversations. And I think that's a big benefit of Indigenous self-government. So I'm going to stop right there. I hope that's enough of a context for people. And And I'm actually, if Daniel's around, I don't see him, but if we can grab that microphone. Ta-da, yes, I like it. We're gonna open up the floor to questions. And I have one for you and maybe the first 2 or 3 people that ask questions. What I'd like to know from you is, and we asked the students in Calgary yesterday, what does self-government mean to you? So try to, if you're gonna ask a question, try to answer that one first and then ask your question. And I think that'll get us going. And we're gonna run out of time really fast, I promise.
Since it's been going on for such a long time, what's the time frame you think of actually eliminating the Indian Act?
Yes, great question. Now, if we leave it to the government, it'll be a long time. 25, let me see, 25 over 30 years, Homer Simpson, denominator 3 during the time, which is problematic. We can't really wait that long, right? And we know, and I'm being really obnoxious here, but when I look at the fall budget coming up, they're slashing $5 billion right off the top. They're looking at reducing Indigenous Services Canada by 1,900 jobs, and they're going to increase. They want another 15% on top of that through 2027. So, I'm teasing about the government a little bit, but they're not going to be able to do anything. They can hardly, deal with the issues they have now: clean drinking water, moldy houses, all of those kinds of issues. So. The kind of self-government that I'm thinking about and talking about, really an inspirational moment for myself was we were going to the Magic Kingdom. Laura, you would have been there in those days. We're going to Florida, and as we were getting ready, packing a couple of days ahead, this media article came out, a Reuters global media article. The Seminole tribe of South Florida had bought the Hard Rock Cafe International Gaming and Food Chain. And at that time, it was $1 billion equity market transaction. And so I thought, this is interesting. So I went to Cindy, my wife, and I said, hey, can we carve out a day of the Magic Kingdom, for, get the kids out of the Magic Kingdom and go talk to the Seminole tribes. They have a tourism business, and they have a cultural center, so she agreed that we would do that, and we went to the cultural center first. We spent a couple of days in Magic Kingdom, needed a little bit of a break from it. Went to the cultural center. I signed in with my traditional name, some Malagalese, and where I was from, the Wawena First Nation, and I saw the sort of the clerk look at the sign in, and he ran into the back, the manager, Daniel, and he came running over and he said, hey, are you an Indian? And I said, well, well, no, you can call me an Indian. And so he said, do you want a tour? And I was like, yes, love a tour. So we got like this backstage tour of the Seminole Tribes Cultural Center. And I really just wanted to ask a couple of questions. One was, how many Seminole tribal members are we talking about? And he said 1,200. And I said, 1,200? And then my second question, the real reason I was there, you guys just bought the Hard Rock International Gaming Food Chain, right? He said, yeah, we did. And I said, tell me about that. Like, how do you get to a place like that? There's only 1,200 of you. I come from a band of about 50 people. So I told them, if I could do at scale what you've done, it would be, we'd be in really great shape. And he said, we were sitting around the tribal council table in the early 1980s, 1982, 1983, and we were talking about the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the role that they had to tribes in the US. So Canada has a Department of Indian Affairs that works with bands. They have a bureau that works with tribes. They live on reservations. We live on reserves. But they were talking about, and their relationship's very similar. Well, there's some pretty big differences. In Canada, a band is a ward of the crown. The federal government is the trustee, and bands and their members are wards of the crown. In the United States, tribes are codependent sovereign nations with the US federal government. So they are treated a little bit differently, but I have talked to, we were talking about mining earlier, and you being at the mining conference, I was working in Nevada one time for a gold mining company, and I said, what's it like working with the Bureau of Indian Affairs? And to answer your question about how fast the response was, man, if we could get those people to pick up the pen and write in the same day, it would be a miracle. And, so that was the challenge. But the Seminole tribe, you know, they said, if we're going to wait for the Bureau to look after us, we're never going to make it. And so that was the decision. This is how fast it can happen. I said, what did you guys do? He said, the first thing we did was, well, we're going to get in the game. And they were talking about the economy. We're going to just do what everybody else does, regardless of the restrictions. And so the first thing we did, he said, was we did a bingo night. And it was pretty successful. So we did another bingo night. And before long, we were doing bingo nights 7 nights a week. And we saw this bingo parlor just outside the reservation come up for sale. So we bought that. And then we bought another one using the proceeds. And we bought another one. And then we saw there was this old casino that was, you know, falling into disrepair. And we thought we'd make an offer on that. We bought that. And basically, the Seminole tribe monopoly gained their way into a $1 billion equity market transaction. And the thing for me and why it was inspirational was it just took a decision, and it happened without the government. And so when I think about self-government, I'm hoping that it can go pretty quickly. I think there's a lot of pressure for communities to do that because you know, we're looking at quite substantial cuts from Indigenous Services Canada, a lot less services and those kinds of things, that they're going to have to move quickly to figure out what to do with their populations. And so that I think would be helpful. And I always tell them the Indian Act is doing what it was designed to do. It's designed to troll people off the list. It's not your friend. It's not going to help you. It's not designed to do that. It's designed to remove you from the list and get you out of the federal government's responsibility. So I'm hoping we can have some urgency on the community side to start saying, you know what, let's do some really important work here. First of all, and politically, I talk about the 3 selves. One of them is self-determination, which I use in a context of citizenship. Instead of having the Department of Indian Affairs write me down as a status Indian and then looking for ways of getting rid of me, we need to take this step of defining our citizenship. Who's a Kwakwaka'wakw Nation member? Who's a Gwawin First Nation member? And we've been doing it. It's been part of our potlatching system. We've always done that as the first piece of work in a potlatch. And I'm planning on a potlatch. That's the first question. Who needs names? And that's our way of making people citizens. And so I think that's work that needs to happen right away. If we don't, the Indian Act continues to troll people off the list, and then lots of problems that come out of that. And it's not just a Canadian thing; it's a U.S. thing. We're seeing tribes in the U.S. who did get involved outside of the Seminole tribe, who got involved in gaming, and they're now doing what's called delisting. I read a book by an Indigenous author of the States who's a tribal member, and she said, you know, if you're splitting gaming revenues, and you know how big the pot's going to be roughly every year, that pot will go a lot further with a lot less people. So they're starting to go back and look at DAWS rolls and other kinds of things like that to actually delist tribal members. And so I think there's a problem, and why we should be involved in citizenship and defining and setting those rules out as part of the self-government process would probably be a pretty important step. And then getting to the place of governance, how do we govern ourselves? So I'm pretty biased here. Obviously, I've got a chief seat and a chief's name. It's a hereditary chief. I inherited. I'll inherit it from my dad, and it'll go to my son. And so I believe, and it's funny because I was talking to my dad about this every once in a while. We get together. He said, "What are you up to?" About a month ago, and I said, I'm just about to drop this book, 21 Things You Need to Know About Indigenous Self-Government." And the first thing he said was, "Are we ready?" And I said, "It really scares me that you're saying that. I think we're going to have to try and figure out an answer to this question. Are we ready?" And honestly, and Laura Whitman, she's been working with me, like we're trying to find the answer. Right? I need a really quick answer to really not get bogged down into a long conversation about readiness. And one of the ideas of readiness is the feeling, it's not an action. And okay, we'll put that on the list. You know, we're kind of going through that process. So finally, I called a friend of mine, Cheryl, who's quite a brilliant thinker and certainly a mentor for me. And I said, Cheryl, I'm wrestling with this idea of this book coming out, and from the community side, they're going to be wondering if we're ready, to be self-governing, and what would you say? And she said, well, Bob Joseph, I'm pretty sure I would say we have been self-governing for the last 10,000 years. And we've been doing it even despite the Indian Act. We've worried about our treaty lands and resources, and I was like, "Ooh, that's the answer I've been looking for." I can move quicker to the readiness question, but to take that second step to start to think about a self-government agreement and really just kind of start having those conversations, and sort of the follow-up step to that is then a constitution that sort of lays it out, and that's what we see happening in the 25 or 26 self-government agreements that are there now. But the third piece is probably the one where I think there's a lot of great opportunity. It's a self-reliance piece. They need to figure out how to become self-reliant. The Indian Act is a dependency relationship. It's not particularly helpful, and we know that it's already chronically underfunded, and we're going into an era where that's going to be even compounded even more. And so the idea of being self-reliant, I think we're in a place where there's a really good opportunity. If the Prime Minister delivers on his in partnership on major projects, they could become involved. There could be employment, procurement, revenue sharing. Those are all the things that they could do to start running and funding their governments and getting involved in the political and economic mainstream of the country. And so that's, I think, those are the three selves. I hope I answered your question. How long is this going to take? I think it can happen quite quickly, but I'm not putting the emphasis on the government doing that.
It sounds like you're also saying self-government will probably come quicker, and then the Indian Act will follow its own.
Yes. And it gets into some important questions. Sovereignty, right? People, is it a separatist movement? No, it's not. We talked about that a little bit, but there would be things that they would want to talk about sovereignty. There was a case that came up recently about two families arguing over who owned songs or crests or masks or that kind of stuff, and it went to the court, and the judge looked at it and said, I'm not sure why you're here. I don't know how to do this, and I don't think I should be doing this. This is a community thing, and you need to really think about this. So that would be a case where it's something really close to them, it's about them. They should be sovereign in that decision-making process, and that's coming from the judge, and from them. And it could be child welfare, and those kinds of things. They should, they would say, we don't want you apprehending our kids. We'll make those calls. We'll decide how to do that. And it's one of the themes of the book. We say, moving to self-government. The Indian Act has been everything about us without us. And where we need to get to is everything about us with us. And that's where self-government can really step in. And we have lots of models of that, whether it's education or healthcare or those kinds of things. We're already seeing that. In terms of the separatist movement, it's not, the criminal code will apply, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, environmental protection, all of those things will continue to apply. Just to add a little bit more to that. But great question. I think we got time for, now I was told by Daniel we only have till 11:30 tonight, so I'm trying to.
Okay, so you said that you've been to Calgary and Saskatoon talking to students about this, but you never really brought up Vancouver and Toronto, and I know that those cities have writers' festivals that are very similar to this one, but not until next month. Are those cities going to be on your to-do list, and the Vancouver Writers' Festival and the Toronto Festival for Authors, I think it's called? Are those on your list of to-do as well as far as promoting this book is concerned? Because if so, then you're probably going to, when you probably get home, wherever that is, you're probably going to have a very short break.
Yeah, I am going to have a short break, but it'll be a good one. I'm going to make the best of it. And yes, we are going to be in Vancouver. We were just in Vancouver last week at a word fest, and we're going to be in Toronto and Ottawa, and I'm trying to figure out how to get to Montreal. And we have been doing a lot of media, the just there's been a number of great articles that have come out, so we're in full-on book promotion, if I can speak like a shameless marketer. And I am feeling tired today, but it's been just because we're 2 weeks on the road steady. Yeah. So thank you, yes. And hopefully we'll see you in Vancouver. Just kidding. All right, another question.
Just curious, and we've kind of talked about this a bit before, but so some of the bands are like One in Tuason, for example, is in a very lucrative area,
Mhm.
lots of resources and lots of people.
Yeah.
So self-governance for them would be quite simple, I would think. How will it look for much smaller bands that don't have like natural resources available to them to be self-reliant?
Wonderful question, and that has to be from somebody that's a product of Betty, that this is totally what you expect. And it is people are sometimes concerned the more remote ones may not have this opportunity, and the urban ones will have lots of opportunity. And I think when in British Columbia, we've been trying to negotiate treaties since the early 1990s, and one of the first efforts to negotiate treaties with the Niska Nation, which is quite a remote community. There's a road, but it's a really long one. You can fly in and you can vote. And I think the province strategically chose that as, let's make this one of our first modern treaties because it's remote and we can show people how this will work. And then they went for the second one, which would have been Tsawwassen. Then we'll show people from British Columbia, here's how it'll look in a more urban setting. And so in the case of the Niska Nation, the Niska ended up with $198 million in cash and about 2,000 square kilometers of lands and resources. That was their settlement package. It included forestry. So if you're a forest company, you're still going to log, but you're eventually, after a 12-year implementation period, your stumpage fees would be paid to the Niska Nation, who would then use that money to do healthcare, housing, education, whatever programs they thought would be beneficial to their community. Currently, they have their hand up for an LNG plant, a floating LNG plant, so they want to get involved in that sort of business. Currently, Manny Jules of the Indian Taxation Advisory Board is working on what he calls a First Nations resource tax, which would be an opt-in tax if they can get the legislation through Parliament. He's had it on the books for probably 6 or 7 years, of it just going off the top of my head. It almost gets there, but then it dies on the order paper when there's a change of government. So we talked about it in the research for this book, and I said, what can I do, Manny? And he said, well, Bobby, if you talk to the parliamentarians or anybody who will listen, try to get all party support for this kind of work, because, if we throw 3-4 years at it, it dies on the order paper, we're going to start all over again. If we could get all party support and get it to continue on, that would be a big deal. And what he was looking for is a First Nations resource tax. And if you had a treaty, or if you didn't have a treaty, you would look at your territory and you would get a 5% resource tax that would go to the nation to do healthcare, housing, education, or whatever they wanted to do to help with their cultural survival. And I remember that was my work at the Niska Nation. One of the big questions that people would ask me, Bob, what is it that they want? It's the same for self-government and for treaties. What is it they want? Just tell me what they want. If I know what they want, I can maybe get behind this thing. And I would say, what they're saying is, if there was a 7-second soundbite, give us some lands and resources, give us the ability to make decisions about those lands and resources, and we'll participate in the political and economic mainstream of this country, but in a way that protects our culture. So they're like the Seminoles, they're trying to stop the language loss and grow the culture. But to do that, they need to break free of the dependency relationship, get involved in the economy. And what we've seen over the last 20, 30 years is it really works when we can move into that direction. I think about, Ontario Hydro or Hydro One, where 88 First Nations are involved in the energy grid, the power line business of Hydro One. And the interesting thing, we talked about the duty to consult and getting free prior informed consent. When you have shares in a business like they do, you're not fighting the business anymore. you're like a shareholder now. Why is it taking you so long, Jamie, to pay us our dividends? And so they want to be involved. Also being a part of Hydro One, they're at the table so they can make recommendations on how to protect moose and cultural heritage and all of that kind of stuff. So I think I'll just stop there. Maybe take another question or two. Yes, please.
Can you explain what you mean by settlement? Like, how does it change the relationship going from Indian Act relationship to this settlement you're talking about, and how does it affect Indigenous land title?
Great question. So I'll use the context of the Niska Treaty. So they like other First Nations across the country have been put onto reserves, and the policy and rationale has been different. Quite often in the early days of the Indian Act, relocating people was to make way for development. So I think about the Fraser Valley, they took them off of all of the agricultural land, they put them on reserves like Chehalis off on the side of the hill, and that was to make way for farmers. Right? And there have been specific claims and cutoff claims and all kinds of process at Indian Affairs to try to do that. But the reserves aren't their territory. They have this broader territory. We're in Treaty 1 territory. We could probably Google it right now and find a map of exactly where it goes. So that would be their territory. There's two kinds. Treaty territory, so there should be boundaries. You'll find a map of Treaty 1. If they haven't negotiated treaties, like where I come from, we haven't negotiated a treaty, so we still have what's called a traditional territory. And so in British Columbia, we haven't done a treaty, but we would like to do a treaty. In fact, that's why we were fighting court cases, even though it was against the law in the Indian Act to raise money for the purpose of hiring legal counsel to pursue land claims activity. We were pushing to get to where other people were, like Winnipeg, Treaty 1. And so we finally, after that was repealed, we saw the Niska start to raise money. They got to the Supreme Court in 1973. They ultimately lose, but it's such a close decision, the federal government decides we need to negotiate a modern treaty, but they didn't have one. So they went to them and they said, we need to know about your traditional territory. If we're going to negotiate with you, we're going to do fish, hunt, practice your religious and spiritual beliefs. So tell us where your territory was. And they required that they put it on a map. And once they had that, there's a 6-stage process. You have to work out your overlaps with neighboring First Nations. So there's a whole BC treaty process. And so that's referred to as a traditional territory. And some of the really, really big treaties that span provinces will have traditional territories within the broader Treaty 8 territory. So we see a couple of instances of that. And I can't remember the second part of your question.
I was asking how the relationship.
Oh, right. How do we change that? So in the case of Niska, a really clear-cut example, they're able to really negotiate their way out of the Indian Act relationship that they had. So their reserves would be transferred. They're not reserve lands anymore. They're called Niska fee simple lands. There's about 3 different categories of lands that they have post-treaty. And then they've got a broader territory, and then they've got a broader, more common territory. And in those different territories, they can do stumpage fees, pass their own environmental assessment legislation. They don't talk to anybody in Indian Affairs anymore. They will show up at provincial gatherings. They definitely participate in municipal government, the Local Government Managers Association. Indian Affairs just doesn't really exist anymore. They have their own citizenship. They have the Niska-Lisms government, which is their central government. And they would still have programs available to other Canadians, just wouldn't be delivered through Indian Affairs anymore. So healthcare, education, those kinds of things. They would still be doing those. They might do it under their own education board. So we're starting to see that pop up in Yellowknife and the Yukon, where they're getting involved in education. And so that's what we see. And I'm not going to give you an exact example because those are what I call common elements. if, you know, a common element is education. Common element is justice. The Niska went as far as negotiating for a Niska judge to sit on a Niska bench. They were successful in their treaty negotiation of getting a Niska judge sitting on a Niska bench, and people were, you know, right away people were like, so does that mean they can pick Daniel? No offense, Daniel. Can Daniel be our judge? No, in order to be a Niska judge sitting on a Niska bench, you have to be a member of the provincial bench, which is where they select judges. And they felt that was really good enough for them. What they were wrestling with at a very fundamental level was incarceration versus rehabilitation. That was the fundamental thing, you know, you've got incarceration at one end, you do the crime, you do the time, and you got rehabilitation on the other end. We're going to try and work with Daniel so he can become a contributing member of society and come work for a great bookstore. And that's what they were really looking for in terms of a Niska judge sitting on a Niska bench. And you know, they actually took issue with you do the crime, you do the time. You know, Daniel, I'm going to pick on you all night now, Daniel. So, because you're laughing, and you got a good sense of humor. You know, Daniel goes and siphons gas from cars so that he can put it in his boat to go fishing to feed his family. He did the crime, he needs to do the time. So that's the incarceration side of things, where they look at it and say, no, you know what, we send Daniel to jail for that. He makes new friends, he comes home with new products. We just have, it's a bigger nightmare for us to deal with. We disagree with the, you do the crime, you do the time. We're gonna work on rehabilitation, we're gonna, you know, do restorative justice. And so that was something that that's a common element that they negotiated. And others have done it a little bit differently, but that's a good example of what you can expect to see. They can, the Niska can do their own environmental assessment legislation, and treaties and self-government agreements, when they are done with governments, which takes a really long time, are often sprinkled with what they call meet or exceed clauses. They can pass their own environmental assessment legislation as long as it meets what everybody else is doing, or it can exceed if they choose to do that. So that helps. Yes, please.
I'm sorry, can I ask you a quick question?
Sure, yes.
Okay, in Wet'suwet'en, that was unceded territory.
Correct.
And the RCMP came and it was illegal. It's illegal to go onto unceded territory and just push a pipeline through, is it not? Because I mean, I thought maybe the RCMP was helping the wrong side there.
Oh, you know, when we talk about negotiating self-government agreements or treaties, laws of general application will apply, and the RCMP would have been in their rights to go and try to maintain law and order. That would be something that they could do. The way they did it, we could talk about, you know, some of those kinds of things, but it is within their rights, and the Niska agreed to that, and other people have signed self-government agreements agree to that, because sometimes they have challenges with their own people. You know, their own people are protesting old growth logging, but it's not a policy of the, you know, the nation that they come from. Just like Canadians will go and protest forestry or other things, right? So they would, it is unceded, but it's it has to do, it's a great prickly question, because what happened was the Crown asserted sovereignty in British Columbia in 1846. They said, this is Crown land, but it was contingent upon them finishing negotiating treaties. They had to acknowledge, they had to do what the proclamation told them they were supposed to do, which they didn't. So the Crown has been saying all this time, if you want to move to British Columbia and do forestry operations or build a pipeline, the Crown has been saying the whole time, this is Crown land, here you go, here's a permit. And recently, and this is where it gets super, and this is where I feel like Morpheus in the Matrix, take the blue pill and everything stays the same, take the red pill and I'll show you how deep the rabbit hole really goes. There's a recent court case with the Chemainus First Nations on the east coast of Vancouver Island. We're suing over ownership, unceded territory on the Fraser River, which is actually across the Salish Sea, formerly the, you know, the Georgia Strait, and they won. In fact, the judges said, look, it's kind of going on too long here. You haven't conquered these people, and you've done nothing legal to get their land. You actually have no authority to give Daniel a fee simple property. And so that's where it's sitting right now in BC Supreme Court. That was the ruling recently. And so you got people in Richmond going, my house? And that's how deep the rabbit hole really goes. And I will say, just in defense of First Nations and watching how they do things, in the Niska Treaty, they deliberately avoided privately held land. They know they need your political support. They're not interested in taking your house, but clearly in this one, the judges waded in, and that just, it's a real game changer. And the court used the words, BC, you didn't have the authority to grant fee simple property here in the first place. Now, that's where it would get tricky. So does the RCMP have a right? And we can get an army of lawyers to just kick that around for 2 decades to see what that looks like. And yeah, so I hope that helps. Great question though. I think we're finally warming up here now. This is gonna be good conversation. And yeah.
And we have time for one more question here.
Okay.
So I'm trying to get my head around the self-government and sovereignty. How does that look? Like I'm stuck in this world where we've got municipalities, provinces, federal government.
Yeah.
Where does this fit?
So it's not a broad separatist movement. Where it fits, I'll give you an example where it sits right now. Maybe that helps us tell where it fits. But in Alberta, they're talking about separation and sovereignty. And the neat thing is, I said, it's not a broad separatist movement. You see the First Nations in Alberta on the evening news saying, well, Alberta, if you want to go, that's fine, but we're staying. And we're going to keep our treaty lands with us here. And the funny thing is that happened in the Quebec referendum as well, way back in the 90s. The Cree in Quebec said, well, if Quebec separates, we're separating from Quebec and we're going to keep our lands here. So that it's not that broad separatist movement. They're not looking for that kind of sovereignty where we're a nation and you have to have a border control and all of those kinds of things. It's not that. Now there may be people that want to negotiate that for a variety of different reasons. Maybe it's the economic opportunity they see in the future. We can become involved in borders patrol services or that kind of stuff. So, and as I stated earlier, the sovereignty is really, the judge is looking at getting involved with Daniel and I fighting over who owns a family crest. He's just looking at it going, I'm not getting into this. This is not my problem. Daniel, Bob, you should work this out. Our nation needs to come up with something. That's not a Canadian court thing to do. So when we think about the criminal code and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, in the case of the Niska Treaty, and I'm not promoting Niska, I'm just trying to give you ideas. The only place where Canada couldn't touch, where they were sovereign, were in language and culture. And the province and the federal government agreed, you're right, Niska, we shouldn't be involved in your language and your culture. We'll leave that to you. But the criminal code applies, Charter of Rights and Freedoms, environmental protection. You'll be a Niskalisms government with 4 village governments, and they may come up with different things, but in other settlement packages. But so I hope that helps just in terms of the sovereignty question, not a broad separatist movement. I will say though, there are people that say we want a country within a country, and all I can tell you about that, and I'm not a federal government representative here, if anybody goes to the federal government and says, Daniel, we want to negotiate sovereignty with you, like a separate country, a nation state within a nation state, they don't talk about it. They don't have a policy, there's no mandate. Everything they do is set to be within confederations. They just don't have, it's not how Canada does things at all. So just if you're wrestling with that whole piece. So nobody's gonna get that kind of. Yeah, yeah. So that, yeah, you know, and like I say, the NISCA show up at local government management association, so they have local powers. And that's, I think I can add to the question, elaborate a little bit here. They have local government powers. They can do taxes, property taxes, all of that kind of stuff. But they have some provincial jurisdiction there too. They can pass their own environmental assessment legislation. They can do forest practices code. They can pass legislation allowing them to do a floating LNG project. So that typically falls to provinces. And they'll have power in healthcare. We want our own health authority if they choose, and everybody will choose what they want. You know, people always used to ask me about the NISCA treaty. Is this like a cookie cutter thing? Like, are we going? Is this NISCA thing? Is this what we're going to be looking at? And I would always say, I like the analogy. We're thinking chef here. Is this a cookie cutter? You're a bakery chef, but that's the wrong hat to be wearing when we're talking about self-government or treaties. The hat you need to be wearing is a dim sum chef. There's 50 different menu items. They can pick and choose whether they want it or not, or how much they're going to get of it. That's what's going to happen for self-government, for any modern treaties or any other kinds. You know, sometimes they don't even want to negotiate treaties, so we have to kind of get creative. But we're not talking about treaties. How about a reconciliation agreement? Okay, let's talk about you know, so there's lots of wiggle room around the edges. We just have to be prepared to talk about it and think about it. Yeah, please.
They do have the authority to go through any money's going to get them. With this, the
Yeah.
local farmer or the local town.
Yeah.
How does that work?
They will operate that way on treaty lands and reserve lands. The government will, and that's why it's looking for these broad sweeping powers. And the broad sweeping powers are the national interest. Look, we got to save our country, we've got to save the economy. So the national interest card is quite a heavy card. It allows them to do stuff. They can go and take up farmers' lands without talking to them. They can do that to local governments. That doesn't mean they're going to be off the hook, you know. So I spent some time in BC Hydro, been a benefactor of great legal briefings, both federal and provincial, and you know, my sense of the conversation has been, look, we're going to do the national interest card. We're going to push this through whether they want it or not, and what we'll deal with is the fallout later on the duty to consult stuff. The judges will wag their finger at us and say, you should have talked to them, but it's a national interest thing. Yeah, but that doesn't get you off the hook. Their legal interests in the land are worth something. You need to go compensate them or do something else. So that's how I think this is going to shake out, unless they can do the partnerships. And it looks like the 5 agreements that they have currently, they're pretty low hanging fruit. Those are projects that were already well underway. They did a lot of talking with those First Nations, you know what I mean? I'm just trying to give you sort of a sense of the lay of the land around major projects. The next ones will be more interesting, where there hasn't been a lot of conversation on an integrated national energy grid, or you know, some new railway system, or maybe ports, or those kinds of things. And I will say though, they're definitely not against development. It can't be development at all costs. They would like the Crown to live up and honor its duty to consult. The honor of the Crown is always at stake, is what the court said in the Haida Weyerhaeuser decision back in 2000. So there you go. I hope that helps. Great questions, by the way. Thank you.
Lovely questions, and I think we're going to move on to our closing comments.
I think we began by saying, thank you so much, Bob, for, I don't know, you have an on button that just allows us reams of incredible ideas and thoughts. And I feel like for those of us who are on the outside edge of this, it's an invitation to think in different ways. It's very exciting. And for those folks in the room for whom it is much more close to home, it's a really important part of the conversations that happen around right relations in our communities. There's a lot going on here in the city and in this province, and we're really glad to have you here sharing information and knowledge from other places and bringing it here. So a big round of applause, please. I learned a lot. I suspect some of you will have learned a lot too. My name, I forgot to say, is Charlene Deal, and I am at the helm of Thin Air, the Writers' Festival that's run by Watts. This is another thing up here. And you will find little swank little pink programs at the back on the way out, so you can pick up a few of those on the way out. We still have 3 full days of programming, so there's still lots to do. But we're really pleased to be teaming up with McNally here tonight for this event. And I will just pause to say this is an extraordinary place for us to gather in the city, and I think that this bookstore is really one of the things that makes Winnipeg such a culturally rich place, and their openness to gathering us together to hear writers of so many flavors and concerns and interests is such an important part of our city. So a big thanks to Daniel, who's probably hiding back there somewhere.
He's doing the right stuff.
Mr. Tech.
Yeah.
And Chris and Angela are at the back. Please do come here often and keep this a really vital center of our city. We are teaming up here with McNally for a couple more events during the festival, just drawing your attention to those. On Saturday night, we're welcoming the Land and Labor Poetry Collective, which is launching an anthology called I'll Get Right on It, Poems on Working Life in the Climate Crisis. It starts at 7 on Saturday. And then on Sunday afternoon, we have this year's incarnation of Nijote Stories, which is named for Theodore Nijote Fontaine, who was a very beloved elder here and a very treasured friend of mine. Who has been really sort of a central part in helping me to develop an idea about how this festival might work and how we might engage in the larger truth and reconciliation conversations. So we will be here on Sunday afternoon, the 28th at 1:30 with Bruce McIver, who is an activist and lawyer and a brilliant man. He's going to be in conversation with Sheila North, so that's going to be memorable. It would be great if you would come to that. And I'm happy to say that Theodore's wife, Morgan, is going to deliver his land acknowledgement, which is a call to community in a very compelling way. Big thanks to PageTwo Books and Raincoast for making this gathering possible. I know you're hopping across the country, Bob, and you're upright, which is great, and you're coherent, which is amazing. Probably not amazing for you, but I know when you're on the road for a long time, it takes a lot.
You sound like an old high school teacher.
I might be an old high school teacher. After the festival is done on Sunday, we do have a few events coming up here where Plymouth Winnipeg is teaming up. And the first one is actually 1 week from tomorrow with Thomas Wharton, who is going to be here on Friday night in conversation with Ben Sigurdsson. And then Sivanka Thamalongsa, who's a really, really brilliant writer, is going to be here on October 21st in conversation with Lindsay Wong. And some of you will notice in the pink program that we were hoping to host Duncan Requity, who's a really extraordinary local poet, this past Tuesday, but that has been postponed. But we now do have a rescheduled date, so he'll be here Sunday, October 26th at 2 p.m. with Rosanna Dearchild, the one and only. So we would love to have you back for any of those. And I got 2 more messages. Okay, I'm nearly done. There is a little QR code on the exit. So if you would take a second to just click through, that gives you a chance to give us some feedback on this amazing event. And I will also suggest that you stay seated while Bob makes his way to the signing table, which is over near the cash desk. And you can get a book signed before you buy it, but you have to buy it before you leave this morning. They do it like that here. So one more warm round of applause for Bob, please.